So welcome everybody, thank you for joining us, and welcome to today's Vulnerability Assessment Informational Webinar for the Climate Smart Adaptation Project for the North Central California Coast and Ocean. Before we get started, I want to review a few housekeeping items and let you know how you can participate in today's session. We have an hour and a half scheduled for this webinar, and it's going to be broken up into two different presentations. Sarah Meadows will be presenting first, and she's going to be providing everyone with an overview of the Climate Smart Adaptation Project. And then Jesse Kirshner will be presenting second and will provide an overview of the vulnerability assessment process that was led in the Sierra Nevada, so that folks can get an idea of what to expect in the upcoming vulnerability assessment workshop. So throughout the two presentations, you can submit questions or comments in writing. In your GoToWebinar control panel, you should have a questions tab, and you can just enter in whatever questions you are and send those to the moderator. We'll be reviewing those questions as they come in, and we'll have a discussion and question and answer period after each of the presentations. So we'll be taking as many questions as we have time for. I think we'll probably just do questions via that written question box rather than trying to unmute everyone. So if you can, just submit your questions via writing, that would be really helpful for us. The webinar today is being recorded, and everyone will receive an email with a link to view the recording of today's event, and we'll also post PDF versions of the presentations and email those to you. So everything from today will be posted on the EcoAdapt website through the Vulnerability Assessment Workshop support page. At this point, I think I will turn it over to Sarah Meadows, who's going to be presenting first. So Sarah.
All right, thank you, Jesse, and thanks everybody for taking the time this afternoon to call in. I think this will be really valuable for us to prepare and kind of front load some of this information ahead of time. We really want to maximize our time at the actual workshop doing the vulnerability assessment. So any talking at you that we need to do, we'd like to do as much of that ahead of time as we can. So thank you. My name is Sarah. I work at the Gulf of Farallones National Marine Sanctuary, and many of you were at the February workshop, and so have heard a little bit of this project background. But this will be just a good opportunity to jog your memories about what this project is about and kind of where we stand in the project, and also to summarize what came out of that February workshop before we focus on where we're headed, which Jesse will take us from there. So for the Climate Smart Adaptation Project for the North Central California Coast and Ocean, we are really aiming to answer two big questions. There we go. The first is, how vulnerable are the species, habitats, and ecosystem services that we care about to climate change? And so what we're considering the first phase of this adaptation project, the vulnerability assessment phase, will really seek to answer that question. Using that information that we're able to gather, we then hope to answer, well then what can we do to limit or reduce this vulnerability? And we'll be addressing that in phase 2 of the project, which is the adaptation planning phase. And just a brief introduction to the term climate smart adaptation. I don't want to assume that you all have heard this term, although it's becoming, I think, much more popular and a part of our everyday lexicon as conservation and natural resource managers. And so if you were to Google that term, you'd come up with lots of different definitions. The one we've kind of adopted for this project has been through probably several iterations, but the most recent comes from Ellie Cohen at Point Blue Conservation Science. And that is that we're seeking to promote nature-based solutions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and enhance carbon sinks, to reduce climate change impacts on wildlife and people and enhance resilience, and to sustain vibrant and diverse ecosystems. And so the goal for this project, it's a little lengthy and wordy, but I think it's very important for all of us to be aware of, and so I'm just going to read it. And it's to protect and maintain healthy ecosystems by enhancing the resilience of species, habitats, and ecosystem services to the impacts of climate change through collaboratively developed adaptive management solutions that are feasible, effective, and nature-based. And so that's lengthy, but I think it does really capture what we're trying to accomplish in this region. And when I say the North Central California coast and ocean, this is the region I'm talking about, and you'll see it's quite large. It's bound to the south by Point Año Nuevo in San Mateo County, and to the north by Alder Creek in Mendocino County. And I will point out, for those of you that have been involved in this project for a little while and are familiar with it, we were originally planning for the second phase, for the adaptation planning phase, to focus on a smaller region, but we've since kind of decided to scale that back up to the larger region that we are focusing on for phase 1. So the entire project will be covering the same larger area. And you'll see that the study area encompasses 3 national marine sanctuaries, including the proposed expansion areas for Cordell Bank and Gulf of Farallon, and 2 national parks. This is a sanctuary project, but it's very collaborative and wouldn't be happening without all of our project partners, so I do want to mention all of them. Everyone here has donated 1 to 2 people to serve on the project planning committee, with the exception of California Academy of Sciences. And this committee has really guided the development of both workshops for this phase, and will continue to play a guiding role in the remainder of the project. I do want to point out that CalAcad did donate their venue for the first workshop, and then we've received generous funds from the California Landscape Conservation Cooperative and the National Park Service to actually put together these 2 workshops. So we're very appreciative of that. And so I mentioned that this project is composed of 2 phases. The first, which we are right in the thick of, is the vulnerability assessment phase, and this is composed of 2 workshops. The first one was to define the focal resources, and the second one will be to assess the vulnerability of those resources. So at the first workshop in February, which I'll provide a little more information on shortly, the goal was for the group to recommend to us species, habitats, and ecosystem services to be the focus of the second workshop, which will use background literature as well as kind of expert opinion to assess the vulnerability of those resources. And this is what Jesse will be really getting into to describe in more detail, so I won't spend any more time on that workshop. And so the second phase of the workshop of the project, the adaptation planning phase, we hope to start this fall once we're able to wrap up these workshops in phase 1. And that will begin with by requesting a working group of the Farallon's Advisory Council. And they'll have a few tasks. The first will be to define distinct climate scenarios for the study region. And for this, we're bringing Point Blue on board because they have experience in doing this. But scenario planning is a method that is being used a lot right now to incorporate uncertainty into adaptation planning. Since we don't know everything about climate change impacts, it's really useful for us to kind of take control of that uncertainty and try to use it to our advantage even. And so scenario planning, you basically, if you look at this example from Futures of Wild Marin Project, you take your most uncertain driver of change and your most impactful driver of change, and you cross those to come up with multiple future scenarios. And so then you kind of have a framework that you can then build upon when you're actually brainstorming and developing your adaptation strategies. You can use those future scenarios to give you a little more control over what you might be able to do to reduce vulnerability. So after the working group defines these different climate scenarios for the future, they'll then use those to develop, evaluate, and prioritize potential actions for each of those climate scenarios. This working group will then kind of take back their recommended actions to the advisory council, and the council will at that point be able to vote and approve those and kind of send those up to the sanctuary superintendent, Maria Brown. And we also want these to be useful for other resource management agencies in the region. Within the sanctuary, though, staff will then take those approved actions and write up an implementation plan for those, including prioritization and scheduling, estimated costs and potential funding sources, and participating partners. So that is really the project in a nutshell, a very quick and dirty version. And so to provide an overview of what we've accomplished so far in this Focal Resources Workshop that many of you on this call probably participated in, we had about 30 scientists, resource managers, nonprofit organization folks come, and they recommended to us the species, habitats, and ecosystem services that they felt should be used in these vulnerability assessments. And they did this by working in small habitat assemblage breakout groups. We had I think four groups. And you'll see they recommended to us, once we went through those and kind of removed any duplicate recommendations, 53 species, 9 ecosystem services, and 10 habitats. And talking with EcoAdapt about kind of what we ended up with as far as these recommended resources, we felt that this is probably still too many for us to be able to assess in a 2-day workshop. So we did kind of go through these and finalize this list and try to cull it down just a little bit more, which you'll see we were maybe a little successful in doing that. It's still quite a lengthy list of species that we're dealing with, but we're going to see what we can accomplish. And so for more details on kind of how we did that, I would refer you to the summary report for the Focal Resources Workshop, which is up on our website, and I'll show you that webpage here shortly. But just to give you a few examples, we were able to remove some species that some of the habitat breakout groups recommended could probably be assessed within kind of the more course level habitat assessment. An example of that is bull kelp. We will have a kelp forest habitat assessment that will likely, well, we'll have to take into account the vulnerability of bull kelp because it is the primary forest forming kelp in this region. We also removed a couple species that had very similar life history traits to other species that were included, and an example of that is steelhead trout. We will be assessing coho and chinook salmon, and so felt that that would likely also apply to the vulnerability of steelhead trout. For the ecosystem services, we ended up combining 2 of those. I think it was protection from erosion and protection from flooding. And for the habitats, we combined the dunes and beaches habitat into one and removed the islands habitat because we felt that we would be able to assess a lot of what you see at the Farallon Islands by assessing the other habitats, including coastal cliffs, rocky intertidal, sandy beach, that sort of thing. So I just wanted to kind of briefly show you, and there is a link there at the bottom of the page so you can actually go to this PDF and spend more time looking at it later. But I did want to go through and show you kind of the final list that we ended up with. And so these are organized by the habitat assemblage on the left. And so this is what came out of that nearshore habitat breakout group. They did recommend these 3 final habitats, which we retained, and then these 16 species fell under their recommendations as well. And so what we're planning to do for the vulnerability assessment workshop is to actually have 3 different breakout groups for these more specific habitat types. We're going to have more numerous breakout groups for this workshop so that those groups can get more work done. And it will just be more functional to have smaller groups instead of 10 to 12 people in one group. And so these 3 groups, you know, they'll get a portion of these 16 species. So it's not like one group is going to be assessing all 16 species because that definitely would not be very feasible. And so here are the offshore and estuary habitat groups. And the offshore group took kind of a different approach to the habitat that they recommended. And they actually recommended very specific shallow banks in the deep water region, including Cordell and Rittenberg banks and Fanny shoals. And so this will be one habitat group with those 9 species. I think they'll probably have the most species to try to get through in their assessment. The estuaries group recommended 2 different habitats, but we'll likely be combining those. And really, the formation of these habitat groups is highly dependent on what we learned from the pre-workshop survey. So it's very important that everybody fills that out as soon as you can, maybe even just after this webinar would be great, so that we can start to figure out, you know, who all's going to be there, what's their area of expertise, and what's the best way to kind of split up these habitats as far as how many species they'll need to assess, how many participants will be in each habitat, that sort of thing. So I can't say for sure what that'll look like, but we're kind of thinking we'll be likely combining those 2 estuary habitats into one group. And then finally, the coastal habitat breakout group recommended, they're the ones that recommended 3 habitats, and we ended up combining the beaches and the dunes, and those are their associated species. And then finally, for ecosystem services, we ended up with 8 of those. And so I think the plan for the workshop is to kind of mix everybody up into 8 different breakout groups to take on one of these ecosystem services. But again, that'll depend on how many people we have coming and kind of their area of expertise. So my last bit of information here, and this is kind of what your homework is, which really shouldn't be too bad. But primarily, we would like for everyone to visit the workshop webpage. And definitely probably a week, 2 weeks in advance of the workshop, we'll have a lot of stuff up. But I'm actually going to go to that real quick so you can see what it looks like. So this is, we had a similar workshop support webpage for the focal resources workshop, and this is the one for the June workshop. And you'll see we have some things up. Some items are still in development, but these handouts you'll definitely want to be at least a little familiar with, so you know what to expect. The things that I would draw your attention to, here's that final focal resources list, which is basically what I just showed you. The climate change impacts table will be posted probably today or tomorrow. These background resource packets. So once you know what habitat group you'll be working in for those 2 days, it would be really beneficial to read the information packet for that habitat specifically. And those will be posted as I'm able to get them together. I have about 3 of those finished right now. So this will be a great source of information for you. Let me go back to this. And so that was number 2, to look at the climate impacts and your habitat information sheets. And then finally, I know I've mentioned this already, but to fill out the pre-workshop survey, because that will not only help EcoAdapt folks know what level of knowledge our participants are coming into this with as far as vulnerability assessments, but also will help us to develop the breakout groups. So that's really it for me. We can take any questions if there are any, and then move on to learn more about those assessments and that process from Jessie.
Yeah, and just a reminder to folks, if you can use the question box on your GoToMeeting control panel, that would be great, just because we want to try and keep this simple. There is one question about the geographic region, Sarah.
Okay.
Holly wants to know, does the area include, I hope I'm pronouncing this right, Ano Nuevo Island?
Yes, it does.
Great. And Ann Merkel wants to also point out that the region includes a National Wildlife Refuge.
Yes, thank you. Good catch.
Those are the only 2 that we had questions so far.
All right, you guys made that easy for me.
Thanks, Sarah. So hi, everybody. My name is Jessie Kirshner. I'm the lead scientist with EcoAdapt, and I'm going to be spending the remainder of the webinar talking about the climate change vulnerability assessment that we led for the Sierra Nevada. Before I get into that, I did want to mention that the agenda for the upcoming vulnerability assessment workshop, and the climate impacts table will be posted later today on that workshop support page. So if you want to take a look at the agenda, it will be available very soon. So I just wanted to provide everybody with a little bit of background about EcoAdapt. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with our organization. We are a nonprofit. We're based in Washington State, and we focus exclusively on climate change adaptation. So our primary goal is to provide support, training, and assistance to make planning and management less vulnerable and more climate smart. And we do this through our 4 primary programs. Our State of Adaptation program is designed to survey the kinds of adaptation activities that are going on primarily across the U.S., but we do have surveys that have looked in Canada and across the world. But what these surveys are designed to find out is the kinds of adaptation activities that people are engaged in, what's working for them, what isn't working for them, where they're getting their funding, and we use this information to create case studies and reports, sort of synthesizing what the state of adaptation is in different ecosystems and across different geographic regions. These case studies are then posted to the Climate Adaptation Knowledge Exchange, or CAKE website, which is our second program. CAKE is a free online resource, and it's designed to connect adaptation practitioners with one another. So whether you are new to adaptation or you've been engaged in it for a while, it's a really great resource. And like I said, we have hundreds of different adaptation case studies that are posted on this website. We have a directory of individuals and organizations that are engaged in adaptation. There is a library resource where you can find different management and planning documents related to different phases of adaptation. So whether you're doing vulnerability or you're more into monitoring and evaluation, there's a tools section, so it has different tools related to adaptation, and then a community section as well. So if you haven't checked out the CAKE website, I'd encourage you to take a look. There's a lot of great information and resources on there. Our last 2 programs are Awareness to Action, and our Adaptation Consultation programs are really designed to work with people at different phases in adaptation planning. So it's where we work with resource managers, or we work with different organizations, agencies, foundations to help them at different phases in adaptation. So whether that's doing a vulnerability assessment, whether that's developing an adaptation plan or designing a monitoring and evaluation framework, we just work with the different partners to help them at those different phases. So EcoAdapt has created an adaptation ladder of engagement, which is quite similar probably to a lot of the climate change adaptation frameworks that you've seen. But we decided the ladder was really useful in the traditional sort of circular adaptive management type of framework because it shows aspiration and the need to move beyond one step or one rung, and it gives you a sense of where you are and where you need to get to. And so even though it's not necessarily circular, you can see that we have these arrows that are meant to imply some of that circularity in there, and that even if you're at one step in this ladder doesn't mean that you can't be engaging at these other steps. But the ladder is comprised of these 7 different steps. The first is general awareness about climate change impacts. The second is focused on assessment, so whether that's a climate impacts assessment or a vulnerability assessment. The third is around adaptation planning, so developing adaptation strategies and actions. The fourth is on implementation, so actually putting into practice those adaptation actions that you've created. The fifth is around monitoring, so not just monitoring for climate change or climate change impacts, but also thinking about what to monitor in terms of management action efficacy. So are your management actions actually successful in the face of climate change? The sixth step is around integration. So this is really where you're not just considering climate change as this separate component to what you do, but rather climate is integrated into everything that you do and has been considered into everything that you're creating in terms of your planning and management decisions. And then the last phase is sharing, so that other people can learn from you and learn from the methods and the process that you went through, and really from your lessons learned. And so, as I mentioned before, you can be engaged at some of these steps at the same time. So even if you're just at the awareness or assessment phase, you can still be sharing your lessons learned and your process with other people so they can learn from you. So I just wanted to present this ladder and provide a little bit of context, as today we're going to be focusing really on this assessment phase for the remainder of my talk, but I want to show sort of where this fits in the larger context of adaptation, and that there's a lot of things that come after a vulnerability assessment, which Sarah touched on in terms of adaptation planning, and then obviously getting further into implementation and monitoring. So the outline for the remainder of my talk, I'm going to be talking about this project with the Forest Service in the Sierra Nevada. I'm going to be providing a bit of context in terms of how the project got started and the need for the project. I'll be talking about the vulnerability assessment process that we use and the components of that process. I'll be presenting the results of that vulnerability assessment and then talking a bit about the broader impacts of the project. So in terms of the project background and how this all got started, for those of you that are not familiar with Forest Service land management practices, there was a new National Forest System planning rule that came out in 2012 that has required all 155 national forests and 20 national grasslands to revise their land management plans. So most of these land management plans haven't been updated since the 1980s, and these plans are now required to be updated with climate change considerations incorporated. So both vulnerability and adaptation need to be considered as people are drafting new management goals and objectives and strategies as they move forward for the next 10 to 15 years of planning for national forests. As part of this rollout of the National Forest Planning Rule, they selected 8 early adopter national forests. So these are sort of the pilot project national forests across the U.S. that are the first to undergo these land management plan revisions and to undergo this process, and really serve to demonstrate to other people how you start to do this and how you incorporate climate. 3 of those early adopter national forests occur in the Sierra Nevada, the Sierra, Sequoia, and Inyo National Forests in the Southern Sierra. And so as part of this sort of impetus from the National Forest System Planning Rule, the Forest Service Regional Office convened a working group that was intended to help the forest begin to start thinking about conducting a vulnerability assessment and developing an adaptation strategy for actually all of the forests in the Sierra Nevada. So there's 10 total. And EcoAdapt was fortunate enough to participate in this working group, and we worked with the Forest Service to apply for funding from the California Landscape Conservation Cooperative in order to actually implement this vulnerability assessment and adaptation strategy project, and we were fortunate enough to receive funding. So in terms of the project need, I've already sort of mentioned this land management revision process, which is this forest plan revision bullet number 2. But there's a number of other needs that this project fills within the Forest Service. And another one is the climate change performance scorecard. So all national forests are required to fill out this climate change performance scorecard annually. And what you can see is that elements 6 and 7 of the scorecard are specifically referencing vulnerability and adaptation. And so forests are required to address at least 7 of the 10 elements of the scorecard. And so we recognized that this was an important need that was being filled for these national forests in the Sierra Nevada by doing this vulnerability adaptation project. But the climate change information that was generated is also meant to inform both the broad scale and local level monitoring strategies that the forest is continually updating. Their resource guidance documents, so these are things like their shorter term 5-year conservation strategies or grazing strategies, and also to inform their project level activities. So for example, if they're going to be retrofitting or removing culverts within a particular area of the forest, understanding which ones are likely to experience more flooding in the future are going to be really important to understanding which ones need to be retrofitted or removed. So really using this vulnerability and adaptation information to feed into all of these different management operation levels for the Forest Service. So I just wanted to present sort of a general project overview to give everyone a bigger picture. So the audience for this project is primarily land managers, so the line officers of the forest that are responsible for managing resources. The scope was the entire Sierra Nevada, so that encompassed 10 national forests. because this is such a large geographic area, we broke our assessment down into 3 different subregions: a north, a central, and a south ecoregion. The north subregion includes Modoc, Lassen, and Plymouth National Forests. The central subregion includes the Tahoe, El Dorado, and Stanislaus National Forests, the Lake Tahoe Basin Management Unit, and Yosemite National Park. And then the south subregion includes the Humboldt, Toyabe, Sierra Sequoia, and Inyo National Forests, and Kings Canyon Sequoia National Park. So at this point, it's important to mention that while this project was really meant to inform these different management operation levels for the Forest Service, it was an all-lands approach. So we did have people from California Department of Fish and Wildlife and Park Service and other folks participating throughout this process. And we assessed the vulnerability of ecosystems, species, and ecosystem services to climate change, and then developed adaptation strategies for ecosystems and species. I will be focusing the remainder of my talk on looking at the vulnerability of ecosystems and species. I'll briefly talk about the ecosystem services that we looked at, and I won't be going into any of the adaptation strategies that were generated, but I will talk a little bit about next steps in terms of adaptation at the end of this. So the Sierra Nevada process is really comprised of four key steps, and I think you all have seen a similar figure like this at the Focal Resources Workshop. But the first step was to identify the focal resources to look at for the assessment, and then to gather relevant background data and information on those resources. The second step was to assess the components of vulnerability for each of the resources during a vulnerability assessment workshop. Following the workshop, we synthesized the vulnerability assessment information that was gathered both during the workshop and through the gathering of that background information. And then the last step was to apply the assessment results and adaptation planning. So again, I'm really going to be focusing on steps 1 through 3. So the first step was to select priority resources, and since most of you have gone through this process already with this North Central California Coast and Ocean project, I won't spend too much time on it, but we utilized a similar approach where we considered coarse filter versus fine filter resources. So this is a pretty common approach. I think most people should be familiar with it. This is where coarse filters capture resource elements such as ecosystems that really occur at these coarser scales. And then fine filters are those resource elements such as species that aren't adequately captured by the coarse filter. So what we did is select a number of coarse filter ecosystems, and then we associated species or fine filters with each of those ecosystems. We went through 2 different prioritization exercises. The first was to develop a ranking and prioritization sort of scoring exercise, similar to what the Gulf of the Farallones has done. And then the second was to go through a second culling process during the vulnerability assessment workshop within the resource groups. So at the workshop, we asked participants to evaluate whether a particular species listed under an ecosystem type was already captured by the coarse filter ecosystem assessment. So an example would be ponderosa pine, which was a species originally on the dry forest ecosystem type. But that species is really already captured by the ecosystem assessment, and so didn't need to be considered separately. Whereas the 2 different species of frogs that we looked at, Sierra Nevada and mountain yellow-legged frogs, both needed to be considered separately from aquatic systems because they have different kinds of challenges and stressors, for example, from the chytrid fungus disease, that really warrant their consideration as a separate resource and really needing to understand what the vulnerability of that resource is. So in the end, we had 8 different ecosystems or habitat types that we selected for the assessment. We had 15 different species, and we had 4 different ecosystem services. So I just wanted to put this up here to give everyone a sense of what was looked at, but I'm not going to spend any time talking about these resources. So the second step of the process was to do the vulnerability assessment itself. And again, I think it's good to get everybody on the same page as to what we mean when we talk about vulnerability. There's 3 components of vulnerability: exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. And I'm going to go into what each of those are in more detail in a minute. But each of these components are important to consider when you're trying to get an overall picture of vulnerability. And our goal through this assessment was really to assess or evaluate the vulnerability of the selected focal resources to both climate and non-climate stressors using literature reviews, spatial climate information, and expert input or elicitation. And I think it's important to remember that vulnerability assessments are really important because they help you to understand what resources are likely to be most vulnerable and why. And the why is really critical because it helps you to design adaptation strategies that can reduce those vulnerabilities. So the vulnerability assessment process was comprised of these 4 key steps. The figure on the right just reflects those steps that are listed. So the first was to collect background information on these different focal resources. The second was to conduct this vulnerability assessment workshop. The third was to assemble and synthesize the information into these draft findings and then send those out for peer review and revise the findings based on comments and feedback. So I'm going to go into each one of these steps in a bit more detail. So in terms of collecting background information, we had a lot of help from a couple of different groups on this particular piece. The GEOS Institute did additional spatial climate analysis and generated downscale climate maps for us for the entire Sierra Nevada region. So we looked at downscale climate information for temperature, precipitation, wildfire, hydrology, and vegetation types. TACAMO, which is the template for assessing climate change impacts and management options, and their web address is at the bottom of this slide. They're a group that is affiliated with the Forest Service, and what they have done is create an online resource of peer-reviewed literature on climate change and different resources and for different reasons, and it's specifically for terrestrial and freshwater ecosystems. But basically, it's an online resource that has assembled all this great peer-reviewed information on climate change and focal resources and for different forests across the U.S. So they assembled peer-reviewed literature on exposure for focal resources, and then EcoAdapt summarized peer-reviewed literature for sensitivity and adaptive capacity. So all of this background information was assembled prior to the workshop. The second step was to conduct this workshop, which was held in March of 2013. During that workshop, participants evaluated the sensitivity, adaptive capacity, and exposure for each resource, and I'm going to go into that in more detail so you know what to expect for the upcoming one. So what happens at a vulnerability assessment workshop, and what can you expect for the upcoming North Central California Coast and Ocean workshop? This workshop in the Sierra Nevada included over 30 participants representing approximately 15 different agencies, organizations, and environmental groups. It was a 2.5-day workshop, so it's a little bit longer. This one was a little longer than the one that we're going to be having in June. But during that workshop, we provided participants with baseline knowledge and understanding of climate trends for the region. So this was looking at temperature, precipitation, hydrology, wildfire, vegetation, things like that. During the workshop, we also assessed the vulnerabilities of focal resources to climate change. And then another part of this workshop, which we won't be covering in the upcoming June workshop, is that we focused on identifying spatial analysis and mapping needs. Part of our project was to create supporting climate-informed maps that could help a user better understand where resources may be more vulnerable, and then to think about what kinds of adaptation strategies may be appropriate in a given region, given the spatial analysis that was provided. So we dedicated a half day of this workshop to just talking about spatial analysis and mapping needs. But in order to assess the vulnerabilities of focal resources, we had participants break out into groups based on their area of expertise. And groups ranged from about 4 to 6 people, so this is going to be a very similar structure to what we will be doing in June. In their breakout groups, the participants worked together to assess the sensitivity of a given resource to climate change and non-climate stressors. I'm going to go into that in more detail in a moment. They also evaluated the adaptive capacity of a given resource, and they identified climate exposure factors and evaluated exposure for the 3 different geographic subregions of the Sierra Nevada. The groups basically assessed the vulnerability for all of their different focal resources that they were considering, and then we brought all of the groups back together for a large group discussion. And this was so that groups could present their findings, talk about some of the questions that they maybe struggled with or didn't have the appropriate information, or were there potential data gaps, and also to answer questions from some of the other groups about the findings of their vulnerability assessment. And then we also started to map out sort of how vulnerabilities of resources were falling in comparison to one another. So really just to sort of start to tell a story of where resources are falling on the spectrum of vulnerability. I'm going to go into a bit more detail of what we mean when we consider each of these factors of vulnerability. So I'll start with assessing sensitivity. And sensitivity is a measure of whether and how a species or habitat is likely to be affected by a given change in climate. So there's a number of different factors to consider when you're assessing the sensitivity of a species or habitat. So the first is around climate and climate-driven changes. So is the habitat or species sensitive to changes in climate, so things like temperature or precipitation, or sensitive to changes in climate-driven factors such as, in this case, snowpack or runoff timing or soil moisture. Also important to think about the sensitivity of the habitat or species to disturbance regimes. So in this case, it was things like wildfire, flooding, drought, and insects and disease. Another important factor to consider are non-climate stressors. So what are the kinds of non-climate stressors that may have the potential to exacerbate the effects of climate change on a resource? So it could be things like residential and commercial development, agriculture or aquaculture, energy production, invasive species, dams and water diversion. Those are all important to think about in the context of sensitivity. For species, there's a couple of additional components that we asked participants to think about, the first of which was dependencies. So this is something about whether or not the species has any key dependencies. Does it depend on a particular prey species, or does it depend on a particular habitat type that's likely to be sensitive or vulnerable to climate change? So, for example, if you're a species that depends on alpine habitats, and that habitat is likely to be eliminated under climate change, then your sensitivity is really likely to be affected. I mean, your overall vulnerability is going to be quite high because of your dependence on that particular habitat type. We also asked participants to think about the life history strategy of the species, what's its reproductive strategy, how often does it reproduce, and how many young does it reproduce. So in terms of assessing exposure, when we say exposure, we're talking about a measure of how much of the change in climate or other environmental factors a species or habitat is likely to experience. In the Sierra Nevada, we considered a number of different climate and climate-driven factors, so temperature, precipitation, snowpack, climatic moisture deficit, and wildfire. And this is just some of them. I wanted to sort of provide folks with a snapshot of what climate change trends look like for the Sierra Nevada. These weren't by at all the number of factors that we looked at. There's quite a few others considered. But what you can see is that annual temperature is projected to increase upwards of 3 degrees Celsius by 2080. Precipitation is projected to decrease in summer and fall with increases in winter. We're projected to see significant declines in snowpack of up to 87% in the Sierra Nevada, most of that occurring in the north and central. Climatic moisture deficit, so this is a measure of soil moisture, and it's a really good indicator for vegetation type. So this moisture deficit is likely to increase by up to 44%, and then we're likely to see significant increases in the area burned by wildfire. So we'll be looking at exposure factors like sea surface temperature, pH, salinity, sea level rise, things like that for our upcoming workshop in June, and we'll be using that climate impacts table that Sarah has developed to help us think about these exposure factors. So lastly, in terms of assessing adaptive capacity, what we mean by adaptive capacity is the ability to accommodate or cope with climate change impacts with minimal disruption. And so there's a number of different kinds of factors that you can start to think about in order to assess the adaptive capacity of habitats or species. The first is around the geographic extent of that habitat or species. Also the status, so this is in terms of species, is it endangered, is it threatened? For habitats, we think about integrity. So whether it's a degraded habitat or quite pristine, and then also the dispersal ability of a species. Also important to think about landscape permeability and dispersal barriers. So in these pictures on the right, we have agriculture and we have residential and commercial development, and geographic features, even mountains and rivers and things like that, can represent barriers to dispersal, so that if climate change impacts are likely to occur, how is it that a species or system could move across the landscape in order to find more suitable habitat or areas. Also, in terms of both species and habitat, we ask participants to think about the diversity. So for species, it's really focused on life history diversity. So what's the ability of the species to express different traits? So things like changes in behavior, phenology, or physiology. And for habitat diversity, it's thinking about not only the physical and topographical diversity of the habitat, but also the component species and functional group diversity. And then lastly, the management potential. So what's the value of that particular species or habitat, and what are the kinds of conflicts that currently exist for that species or habitat? Because, and what's our ability to manage those conflicts? Because that's really going to affect our ability to do anything as well in the future. So these factors are ones that we really consider for this year in Nevada, and for our other projects based on terrestrial and freshwater ecosystems, that they're going to be very similar in concept to what we're going to be looking at the June workshop. So this is just an overall figure to give you a sense of how these all fit together and what it is that's coming out of this. So for each of these three components of vulnerability, we'll be asking participants to provide a score, or a score for each of the different elements I just talked about. So life history, diversity, and dispersal ability. So participants during this workshop will be providing a score and then also providing comments. Those scores for each of those three components are combined, and to get an overall estimate of vulnerability. As part of this scoring exercise, we ask participants to evaluate their confidence in their assessment. So this is based on IPCC methodology. But basically, how confident are you that you assigned a score of high for this particular species sensitivity to temperature? So as part of each of these component evaluations, we also have narratives which are comprised of comments from participants, but also from information from the peer-reviewed literature. And both the confidence evaluation and the narratives are really important because they help document uncertainty in the process. So it really does, it is really important to understand how confident folks are in evaluating a particular stressor or a particular, life history type or something, so that we can start to see where there's gaps in information, and where potentially there may be peer review information to support that, even if participants didn't have that. But really, these two key pieces help to document uncertainty in this process. So the last two steps of this assessment were to assemble and synthesize the information. So these were the findings from the workshop and the peer review literature were assembled into these draft vulnerability assessment findings, which were sent out to topic experts that generally did not attend the workshop to review and then revise. So I want to present an example of what the findings would look like for one of the ecosystems that we looked at, just so folks can get a sense of the kinds of information that comes out of this process. This is obviously very much a simplification, but again, just intended to sort of give you an idea of what is generated. So in terms of sensitivity of wet meadows to climate and climate-driven changes, that sensitivity was evaluated as being moderate to high. Wet meadow distribution, type, and vegetation is all really determined by hydrology. And so the sensitivity of the system is really driven by altered precipitation, decreased snowpack, and changes in hydrology. These systems also exhibit really high sensitivity to non-climate stressors such as water diversion, grazing, and recreational activities. So for example, grazing causes soil compaction, which means less water is stored within the system. So if you already have sensitivities to water, keeping less water in the system is really going to be an issue and influence your overall sensitivity. In terms of future climate exposure, again, not surprisingly, because these ecosystems are dependent on water, it's changes in precipitation type, timing, and amount that in turn affect hydrologic regimes and soil moisture that are going to be most important to consider when you're looking at future climate impacts. The adaptive capacity of these systems is evaluated actually as being moderate to high as well. This is due to the fact that these systems have high component species diversity, although they do exist in a really fragmented distribution across the Sierra Nevada, and many of the meadows are in a currently degraded state. So this is just a snapshot of some of these key pieces that came out, but wanted to give you a sense of what the findings look like. So now that I've presented you with an example for one particular ecosystem, I want to show you a summary that we did across systems and across species. So this is the vulnerability assessment results summarized across ecosystems for the Sierra Nevada. The slide is broken up into the 3 different geographic subregions. So in the upper right-hand corner, it's the north geographic subregion. Bottom left is central, and bottom right is south. I'm just going to focus on the north in the upper right and orient you to the figure. So along the x-axis, along the top, we have sensitivity and climate exposure. So as you move from left to right, you move from low sensitivity and exposure to high sensitivity and exposure. On the y-axis, you have adaptive capacity, and you can see as you move from the bottom, you move from low adaptive capacity to high. So if you look in that upper left quadrant of the North Sierra Nevada figure, what you can see is that those ecosystems with low sensitivity and low exposure but high adaptive capacity are thought to have low vulnerability. So it's that green bubble. If you look at those ecosystems in the bottom right, those have high sensitivity and high exposure and low adaptive capacity. So it's that red bubble where they're thought to have high vulnerability. So what you can see, just again, I'm focusing only on the north subregion, what you can see is that most of those ecosystems really fell out in that moderate vulnerability range, having both sort of moderate sensitivity and exposure and moderate adaptive capacity. The 2 outliers were oak woodlands and then the alpine and subalpine ecosystems. So oak woodlands is really close to that low vulnerability bubble. These ecosystems were evaluated as having the least vulnerability because they have a pretty wide distribution across the Sierra Nevada, and they exhibit general resistance to short-term changes and pretty high tolerance for changing conditions for things like increases in temperature and drought. The alpine-subalpine ecosystem, on the other hand, is one that was evaluated as having much higher vulnerability. So this was particularly due to changes in climate exposure, for example, in the north in particular, where there's going to be some significant declines in snowpack and increases in temperature. So I just want to give folks a sense of how you can start to compare vulnerabilities across resources and what it provides in terms of an overall picture. So we generated the same kind of figure for species. And again, I'll focus on that upper right figure for the North Sierra Nevada. And what you can see is there's a whole subset of species that, again, fall out in that more moderate vulnerability. So you can see the 2 different oak species, fisher, mountain quail, and sage grouse. Then you have another subset of species that's falling out with much higher vulnerability. So, for example, these are whitebark pine, willow flycatcher, and red fir. These particular species, so for example, red fir and willow flycatcher are 2 species that occur in high elevation habitats, and they're particularly sensitive to changes in hydrology, so things like changes in snowpack or soil moisture. And these changes either affect the species directly, which is the case for red fir, or they affect the habitat the species depends on, which is the case for willow flycatcher, which live in wet meadows. So just again, to give you sort of an overall sense of how you can start to compare vulnerabilities to one another and why certain species may come out as being more vulnerable than others. So there was a number of products that came out as part of this effort. The first was the workshop support page, which you should already be familiar with, at least for the project that we're currently working on for the North Central California coast. But we had a Fear Nevada workshop support page where we posted all of the presentations, handouts, background information packets for people to access. We created a vulnerability assessment report. So this report details the methodologies, including how the focal resources were selected and the vulnerability assessment model we used and how it was applied. And the report also details the findings from the assessment itself. We did actually end up summarizing the focal resource vulnerabilities into 2 different kinds of products. And this is because we received some additional funding later on in the project to create these shorter vulnerability assessment briefings. So the first products that we created are these full vulnerability assessment syntheses, which range anywhere from 8 to 20 pages. These syntheses are comprised of information from the workshop, from the peer-reviewed literature, and from the comments we received from the experts that we sent this out for review from. It was the original deliverable that was described in our grant from the California LCC, and so these are the results that were included in that final report. The purpose of these full syntheses was really to provide transparency for all of the information that was collected through this whole process. And the audience for the syntheses is primarily scientists and others who want really a more detailed picture about the information that was gathered and the process and findings. The briefings, on the other hand, are much shorter documents. They're shorter synopses that really highlight the key sensitivity, exposure, and adaptive capacity figures for a given resource. And the purpose of these documents is really just to summarize the key vulnerability points for a given resource. And the audience was primarily resource managers. These briefings are available as standalone documents. And I just want to show folks a quick example of what I mean by each of these. So the one that's on the main screen right now is the vulnerability assessment synthesis that was created for Wet Meadows. So this is a much longer 20-page document. And what you can see is it just provides you with a general overview of the process, the scope and definitions, the methods that were used, and then we have a summary of the scoring in these tables. So you can see the score that was provided by the participants during the workshop and their confidence in that score. And then we also have sections that break each of those questions down again into the score and the confidence, the comments that we received from participants at the workshop, and then the references that were found on that particular topic from the peer-reviewed literature. So again, much longer documents really meant to encapsulate all the information that was collected as part of this process. The other briefings that we created are much shorter. So this one just describes sort of the key terminology and background information of the process. And then we have this executive summary section, which really highlights the important sensitivity, exposure, and adaptive capacity factors. And then it goes into more detail on each. So what you can see is that we have sensitivity to climate and climate-driven changes, future climate exposure, and this is really supported by the peer-reviewed literature, and again was sent out to topic experts for review and support to help us frame these in the correct context. So shorter, more focused documents meant to provide resource managers with the information that they need quickly. And the last thing that I want to mention about this vulnerability assessment process was just that it was intended to be a living resource. We've given the report's version numbers on purpose in hopes that we can add more information to it as it becomes available. But we do encourage people to take a look at that TACMA website in the meantime to keep apprised of new information or new climate-related information on these resources as it becomes available. So as I mentioned before, you know, this information from the vulnerability assessment was used to help develop adaptation strategies and actions. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but I did want to put this vulnerability assessment again in a larger context. And again, that the purpose of doing this vulnerability assessment really is to identify resources that are vulnerable and why, because the why is where we can design those adaptation strategies and actions. And so just a quick example of how you can apply the assessment results in adaptation planning, and how you can target adaptation strategies for those different components of vulnerability. So wanting to reduce the sensitivity, reduce the exposure, or enhance the adaptive capacity of a particular resource. So an example of reducing the sensitivity would be actively planting drought-tolerant species in an area projected to get drier. An example of reducing exposure would be replanting riparian vegetation. So it provides shade and it helps limit temperature increases in aquatic environments. Enhancing adaptive capacity could be something like removing coastal armoring to help facilitate wetland accretion. So again, just want to provide everybody with a larger context that the vulnerability assessment is really only, the second step in this much larger process, and the direction that this is going is really to focus more on, once we understand what these vulnerabilities are, what is it that we can do to reduce those vulnerabilities. So lastly, in terms of broader impacts of the project, I mentioned earlier, the information from this has been used to help forests address those climate change performance scorecard elements for vulnerability and adaptation. So there was a number, I think, in terms of vulnerability, we had a number of forests from like 54% that originally said yes last year. We're now able up to 75% of forests to say yes, we addressed vulnerability. The information from the assessment was also used as part of this forest plan revision process to inform a bioregional assessment that was created. So essentially this was the state of the science for the Sierra Nevada, and this helped to inform that and feed into that. Again, this provided information for those early adopter forests as they work to revise their land management plans. And lastly, I just want to mention that the methodology and process used here has been implemented in other places, including Alaska, different locations in California, and with Forest Service efforts in Idaho, Montana, and the Dakotas. So it extends beyond what we're doing here, and just wanted to let folks know that it's being used in a lot of different places. So I just want to say thank you to our funders, the California LCC and the Forest Service and the Yale Mapping Framework, and to thank our partners, GEOS Institute, Conservation Biology Institute, and Tacoma.